Hey guys, tonight we're going to slide back in time quietly now to the dusty stone homes and flickering torchlight of medieval Europe. The air smells faintly of burnt tallow and hay. You're lying on a stiff straw mattress, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket, listening to the distant howl of the wind and maybe a rat rustling in the rafters. But you're not asleep. Not really. Because it's not time yet. See, in the Middle Ages, people didn't sleep the way we do now. They had what was called segmented sleep, two distinct phases of sleep broken up by a mysterious wakeful period in the middle of the night. And this wasn't considered strange at all. In fact, it was the norm across Europe for centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time you're listening in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes just after sunset, the room dark except for the glowing coals in the hearth. After a couple hours of sleep, you wake up refreshed, but not alarmed. It's pitch black, but there's activity. This is the watch, a peaceful hour or two where people got out of bed to read, pray, stoke the fire, even visit neighbors or have sex. Then, they'd go back to sleep for the second phase. Historians call this biphasic sleep, and it turns out it might actually be more natural than our current 8-hour stretch. No one thought it odd. In fact, there are dozens of medieval texts referencing the first sleep and the second sleep, like it was as ordinary as breakfast. A 13th century medical manual even gives health advice based on the time between your two sleeps. Modern scholars believe this segmented pattern was tied to natural light without artificial lighting. Your body simply obeyed the dark. But here's the kicker. Historians still argue whether this practice was biologically hardwired or just a culturally conditioned habit. Was this how humans naturally slept before Edison messed everything up with the light bulb? Or was it just the best way to manage long winter nights without Netflix? And during that in-between time, people didn't just sit around yawning. Some lit candles and read scripture. Others used it as a moment of reflection or even creative work. You might write a poem or check on your chickens. Or start preparing breakfast at 2:30 a.m., which feels pretty medieval in its own right. There's even evidence that this gap in the night was a popular time for spiritual activity. Monks designed their prayers around it, believing it was the hour when heaven and earth were closest. On a more superstitious note, some thought this was when spirits walked freely, so if you were awake, best to keep quiet and maybe sleep with a dagger nearby. But perhaps the weirdest part? Some sources suggest that doctors recommended the time between first and second sleep for conception. That's right, if you were trying to have a baby, you'd set an alarm clock made of a rooster and a prayer. The whole practice slowly began to vanish in the 17th and 18th centuries. As candles got cheaper and street lighting became common in cities, people stayed up later. The watch gradually merged with evening hours, and eventually the two sleeps became one long night. And yet, if you ever wake up at 2 a.m. and feel strangely alert, now you know you're not broken. You might just be medieval. You stretch and roll over. But instead of a soft memory foam mattress and clean cotton sheets, your bed crackles. Literally. That's because you're lying on a sack of straw, and each shift of your body sets off a chorus of rustles, pops, and the occasional suspicious scuttle. Welcome to medieval bedding, a place where sleep wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Beds, if you were lucky enough to have one, were often little more than wooden frames with rope supports, topped by a coarse mattress stuffed with straw, hay, reeds, or even dried leaves. The wealthy might afford feathers or wool, but even those weren't exactly hypoallergenic. You know that dreamy hotel bed bounce? Forget it. This was more like sleeping on a noisy granola bar. And worse yet, bugs, fleas, lice, and mites were just part of the nightly routine. You didn't sleep alone, you hosted an entire parasite party. Some people actually dusted their mattresses with herbs like lavender or wormwood to deter these unwelcome guests. Others just scratched a lot and got used to it. One 14th century housekeeper's manual even recommends airing out your mattress regularly to remove foul humours. Translation? It stank, especially after a few weeks of sweat, spilled ale, and your cousin wetting the bed. Again, Let's not forget that bed making was a real chore. You'd fluff the straw, yes, fluff it, beat out the dust with a stick, and rotate it to avoid uneven clumps. And even then, you'd eventually need to burn the old straw and stuff the mattress anew. A fresh bed smelled less like rot and more like a barn. Progress. But here's a fun twist. For many peasants, there was no actual bed frame at all. You just laid your mattress, or maybe just a blanket on the packed earth floor. In winter, you might curl up beside the fireplace for warmth, meaning your bedroom was shared with the family goat, the smell of smoke, and every creak of the wind rattling the shutters. And still, this was better than nothing. The truly poor sometimes didn't even have indoor shelter, let alone a mattress. Vagabonds and labourers might sleep under carts or lean against trees, wrapping themselves in cloaks or hay bales. Historians still argue whether homelessness was seen as a moral failing or simply an occupational hazard of peasant life. Now, if you were among the elite, your bed did look a little more inviting at first glance. Carved four-poster beds with heavy curtains, feather mattresses, and embroidered sheets. But even these were often musty, dim, and shared. And yes, even noble bedding had its bugs, just with better embroidery. One quirky tidbit? In some castles, beds were intentionally short, not because people were shorter, but because they slept sitting upright. Why? The belief that lying flat invited death. Being reclined was for corpses, not for counts. You'd prop yourself up with pillows, keeping your head elevated in case your humours decided to attack. Still, the humble straw mattress stuck around for centuries. In fact, its use lasted into the early 20th century in parts of rural Europe. That's a lot of itchy, crinkly nights. And if you're picturing some cosy family scene of everyone sleeping soundly under woolen blankets, pause that thought. Wool was expensive, so were blankets. Most people layered up in their regular clothes, or even their daytime tunics, and hoped the fire didn't go out. You could be toasty near the hearth, or freeze 10 feet away. But even among this scratchy discomfort, people managed to sleep. Deep, dream-filled sleep. Maybe it was the hard labour, or the cold ale, or simply the exhaustion of surviving another day. Or maybe, despite everything, the soft hiss of straw beneath your head was its own lullaby. So tonight, as you sink deeper into your far too comfortable bed, take a moment to appreciate the silent miracle of clean sheets, a warm blanket, and not waking up with a beetle in your ear. It's late. The fire is low. You finally find a quiet spot to sleep, only to realize you're not alone. There's a stranger in your bed, not metaphorically, literally. And no, you don't know their name. You don't even know where they're from. But here you both are, tucked in like cousins at a family reunion gone wrong. Welcome to bed sharing in the Middle Ages. A surprisingly common practice, even among strangers, and not in some sketchy way. It was just normal. Travelling merchants, pilgrims, or visiting guests would often bunk up with others, even complete unknowns, to save space, stay warm, and, in some cases, avoid the cost of a private bed. At rural inns, sometimes called hostelries, or guest houses, rooms weren't rented per person. They were rented per bed. So if you paid for a spot, you'd likely be sharing your mattress with someone else who had done the same. There are records of up to 4 or 5 people sleeping together in one large bed. Cozy? Only if everyone bathed recently, which they didn't. But before you clutch your pillow tighter, understand the context. In an era with little central heating and no electric lights, body heat mattered. Sharing a bed wasn't just about cost, it was about survival, especially during frigid winters or long-distance travels. The more bodies, the warmer the sleep. In some places it was affectionately called bundling in. Even monks and nuns sometimes shared dormitories in silence, row after row of hard wooden planks, each topped with a thin blanket and an even thinner sense of privacy. And don't forget the family setup. In a peasant's home, the single shared bed might host parents, children, a baby or two, and maybe even a servant, all packed together like spoons in a drawer. Bedtime wasn't quiet. It was a chorus of coughs, snores, and shifting bodies. This also made the bed a hotbed, pun intended, for storytelling. Whispered tales, local gossip, and secret confessions often happened in the dark, when ears outnumbered eyes and voices could slip through the silence. One 15th century diary recounts a man on pilgrimage who shared beds with over 30 different people during his journey. Some were friendly, some stole his food. One, he claimed, smelled like a dead fox dipped in cabbage. You never knew what or who you were climbing in beside, and yet it wasn't scandalous. In fact, it was considered prudent. Better to sleep in a full bed than freeze alone. People judged you more for selfishness than for bed sharing. Turning down an offered space might be seen as arrogant. Still, historians still argue whether this communal sleep culture truly fostered trust or just made people better at pretending they didn't mind someone else's elbow in their ribs. Interestingly, the practice extended beyond inns and homes. In some medieval universities, students shared beds in dormitories while cramming for exams and probably coughing on each other the whole time. Apprentices often slept beside their masters, not for fun, but because space was tight and heat was tighter. Of course, there were risks. Bed sharing could spread lice, fleas, diseases, and occasionally rumors. That's why wealthier households went to great lengths to have separate beds for guests, though even that wasn't guaranteed. Space was a luxury, and privacy was a myth. In noble homes, the guest might be offered a spot beside a servant, or even the host's own children. Imagine showing up for a weekend and being told, "You'll be sleeping next to Jeffrey, our 1-2-year-old who dreams loudly." Still, people made do. They respected the unspoken bedtime etiquette. Don't hog the blanket, don't kick, and definitely no midnight conversations unless absolutely necessary. The middle of the night was for sleep or prayer, or quietly contemplating whether the person snoring beside you might be cursed. And you? You'd better stay still. No one liked a bed hog in medieval times. You might wake up wrapped in the corner of a sheep's wool blanket, the rest claimed by your new best friend with the bad breath and a suspicious cough. So next time you toss and turn alone in your comfy bed, consider this. In the past, sleep wasn't just a solo act. It was a group project, often graded in sneezes. You pull the blanket up, try to shift away from the snoozing stranger beside you, and suddenly feel something brush your face. Fabric heavy, velvet, and dusty. It's not the blanket. It's the curtain. Welcome to the medieval bed curtain. A thick drapery hung around the bed like a miniature fortress. And yes, it served a purpose. Many, actually. Curtains weren't just decorative, they were essential. Whether you were nobility or just lucky enough to have a wooden bed frame, your sleeping space was often wrapped in 4 thick panels of cloth that could be pulled shut from all sides. And they weren't just for privacy, though. That was definitely a plus when you were sharing your bed with your cousin and a goat. Primarily, curtains were about heat. Drafty stone houses, single fireplaces, and zero insulation meant that a medieval winter night could feel like sleeping in a cave. Drawing the curtains trapped warmth, turning your bed into a cozy and slightly musty cocoon. In fact, some wealthier homes even layered their beds with inner and outer curtains for double protection. Very chic, very sweaty. But there were other perks. Curtains kept out bugs well, some bugs and maybe the occasional bat. They blocked moonlight, wind, and the unwanted gaze of your nosy relatives. And if you were of the noble class, they added an extra touch of status and flair. The more elaborate your bed curtains, the fancier you looked, even if you snored like a warhorse. And we're talking about serious construction here. Beds were often massive, carved from oak or walnut, with built-in poles designed to support yards and yards of fabric. Heavy wool, embroidered linen, dyed velvet, all draped with purpose. Some beds even had canopies, creating a tent-like enclosure that turned the act of going to bed into entering a royal chamber. Oddly enough, these curtains weren't always attached to the bed itself. In more humble homes, they might hang from ceiling beams or wall hooks, making the entire sleeping space resemble a theatrical prop from a medieval soap opera. And let's talk about noise, because medieval nights were not quiet. Think of neighbours arguing, dogs barking, pigs snorting, and people relieving themselves into chamber pots right beside the bed. Curtains muffled that cacophony, if only slightly. They offered an auditory illusion of peace. And in the age before white noise machines, that was gold. Some even believed bed curtains offered spiritual protection. In certain regions, they were embroidered with crosses or charms to ward off demons, witches, and nighttime terrors. A bed without curtains? Practically an open invitation for the devil. You can't be too careful when dreaming near a leaky roof and suspicious shadows. Still, historians debate whether curtains were more about function or fashion. Were they truly a common feature for the average household, or mainly for those flaunting wealth? We know for sure that by the 14th century, curtain beds were prized enough to be listed in wills and inventories, passed down like precious heirlooms. One noblewoman reportedly had her entire bedroom, including her crimson bed curtains, shipped from castle to castle, and not in a little chest. We're talking full wagon loads of sleeping elegance. On the flip side, the average peasant's curtain, if they had one, was probably made of scratchy wool or leftover sackcloth. Functional, not fancy. It might even be repurposed from old clothing, or patched together from whatever scraps they could find. Even monasteries had curtain systems. Though monks slept in dormitory-style rows, senior or ill monks often had small partitioned beds with simple curtains, offering a tiny taste of privacy. Imagine the spiritual contemplation you could do behind a linen sheet in the middle of a freezing stone hall. But curtain beds weren't all soft shadows and muffled snores. In warmer months, they could turn your sleep into a sweaty medieval sauna. Trapped heat, zero airflow, and layers of wool meant you might wake up feeling more boiled than rested. Some people even tied back the curtains to let in a breeze or the occasional mosquito. And if you think your fitted sheet is a pain, try adjusting a 20-pound curtain panel by candlelight, half asleep, with a chicken on your feet. Still, as you drift deeper into this medieval dreamscape, picture yourself behind those curtains. The flicker of a dying candle, the scent of lavender tucked in the folds, the quiet shuffle of others settling in for the night. You're wrapped in history, one woven panel at a time. The room is split by class, and so is your bed. Tonight, you find yourself standing between two wildly different sleeping worlds. The noble four-poster bed, draped in velvet and guarded by a servant, and the peasant's humble pallet, a straw-filled mat laid on the dirt floor, possibly shared with a dog named Don't Wake Me. In medieval times, where and how you slept was a flashing neon sign of your social rank. If neon signs had existed, that is. Let's start with the aristocrats. A noble bed was not merely furniture, it was an announcement of status. Often taller than you were, made of carved hardwoods like oak or walnut, these beds were intricately designed and deliberately massive. They were also absurdly high off the ground. Why? Because luxury, darling, and also because you could stuff extra bedding, chests, and occasionally a terrified servant underneath. To climb into such a bed, you might need a footstool or two, possibly an assistant, and enough elegance to not trip on your nightgown. Once aboard, you'd sink into a stack of feather mattresses. Yes, more than one layered like a royal lasagna. Then came the sheets. Fine linen if you were truly posh, coarse hemp if you were slightly less so. Blankets, woven wool, sometimes trimmed with fur. Imagine curling up beneath fox pelts to the soft glow of candlelight while your servant dozed quietly at the foot of your bed on the floor. Meanwhile, back on the ground, literally, the peasants did not enjoy any such extravagance. The pallet bed was simple. A straw or hay mattress, sometimes on a wooden board, often directly on the packed dirt. Maybe a rough blanket, or an old tunic draped over you like a sad hug. Comfort was not the goal. Warmth and survival were. The floors of peasant homes were cold, uneven, and often shared with animals. Yes, livestock. A pig might wander by your head at midnight. A chicken might decide your leg looks like a perch. The benefit? Free foot warming. The downside? Poop. Lots of it. And let's talk about the bedfellow you didn't choose, vermin. Rats and mice were common bed companions in both manor and hut. Even noble homes, with all their glamour, couldn't keep out the scratching and squeaking. Some wealthier folks hung metal or leather bed traps beneath their mattresses to deter rodents from crawling up. It only mostly worked. Now, you might assume nobility had it easy, but comfort came with quirks. For example, some lords and ladies insisted their beds face east, toward Jerusalem. Others would sprinkle rosewater on their sheets before bed, or have their maids beat the mattress to wake the spirits. Whether that made for better dreams is still up for scholarly debate. One thing's certain, no peasant was wasting rosewater on straw. There's also the matter of bed ownership. Beds were so valuable that in medieval wills, they were itemized right next to land and livestock. To my eldest son, I leave the manor. To my daughter, the walnut bed with silver hinges. You knew you'd made it in life when someone inherited your mattress. Yet despite the gulf between noble and peasant, everyone had one thing in common: the cold. Without insulation or central heat, both ends of society had to contend with icy nights. Nobles used fur throws and body heat. Peasants used layers of clothing, huddled family members, and let's be honest, just tried not to freeze. One rare and quirky overlap: the warming pan. A metal dish filled with hot coals slid between the sheets to take the chill off. Rich households had servants to do it. Poor folks might improvise with heated stones wrapped in cloth. Either way, nothing like falling asleep beside a tiny burning object to keep things spicy. Historians still argue whether the quality of medieval sleep truly differed by class. Sure, the bed was fancier, but rich folk had responsibilities, stress, and the same midnight demons whispering in the dark. Sometimes, the peasant exhausted from labour and wrapped in hay might sleep more deeply than a countess, plagued by estate worries and 3 layers of itchy lace. So as you drift now, picture it all. The carved canopy above a noble head, the flicker of candlelight against silk curtains, the earthy smell of straw beneath a peasant's cheek. Both sleep, both dream, and both, somehow, manage to greet the same dawn. The fire flickers low, shadows stretch across the wooden beams, and the temperature starts to bite. Time for bed. But before you settle in, one question remains. What exactly are you wearing? Well, depending on who you were in medieval society, the answer could range from absolutely nothing to enough layers to qualify as a walking laundry basket. Sleepwear, you see, was not standardized. It was deeply personal, heavily cultural, and sometimes non-existent. Let's begin with the naked sleepers, because yes, they existed. In fact, for much of the medieval period, sleeping nude was considered healthy. Physicians of the time believed fresh air helped the body balance its humours, those lovely medieval fluids like blood and bile you're always hearing about. A cool breeze under the blanket was thought to promote circulation, clear the skin, and even help digestion. Monks, however, would strongly disagree. In most monastic orders, sleeping naked was not just frowned upon, it was forbidden. A monk was expected to sleep in his habit, sometimes even with a belt or cord tied around the waist. The idea was to be ever ready for prayer or spiritual combat, and also to suppress any, let's say, worldly temptations. No funny business under those robes, thank you very much. For the average peasant, sleepwear was whatever you were already wearing. Changing into a separate nightgown wasn't common. Why waste time or risk getting cold when you could just sleep in your tunic, wool hose, and undershirt? Some folks even kept their boots on, especially if the floor was wet or the chickens were aggressive. Now, if you had a bit of coin, you might own a nightshirt, a loose, long linen garment resembling a modern-day oversized t-shirt with medieval flair. These were usually undyed and coarse, more about function than fashion. Still, it beat having a flea-bitten wool tunic pressed to your skin all night. And then there's the odd but delightful tradition of the nightcap. No, not a drink, although some ale before bed wasn't uncommon, but an actual hat usually knit, often long and pointed, sometimes with a tassel that flopped like a sleepy wizard's hat. These weren't just for style. Most homes were cold, and you lost heat fastest through your head, so keeping it covered was essential. The upper classes took sleepwear a bit more seriously. Silk nightgowns, fur-lined robes, and even bed slippers were part of the bedtime ritual. One duchess reportedly had her chambermaid warm her slippers by the hearth before she even stepped out of bed. Now that's luxury. Sleepwear also became part of bedroom etiquette. If you were summoned unexpectedly at night, say, by a knocking monk, a sick child, or a neighbour who thought they heard demons, you'd throw on a night rail or overgown. Think of it as a medieval robe, fast to throw on, modest enough to appear half decent, and hopefully not crawling with fleas. But the variation didn't end there. In some colder climates, people layered multiple linen shifts, wrapping themselves mummy-style to trap heat. Others tied fabric around their arms and legs to stop vermin from crawling under the sheets. It was practical, sure, but also vaguely horrifying. Interestingly, historians still argue whether medieval people had designated sleep clothes at all. Some say nightwear didn't become common until the 17th century. Others argue that fragments of linen and wool found near bed sites suggest people did have separate sleeping garments, just not ones they bragged about. And then there were bed bonnets, soft cloth caps tied under the chin, worn mostly by women. These served two purposes: warmth and modesty. Even in sleep, a proper lady didn't let her hair go wild. A dishevelled head in the morning could spark gossip faster than a bad pie at a feast. But perhaps the most charming note is that some families made matching nightshirts, especially for children. These would be hand-sewn, often from scraps of older clothing, and passed down through generations. If you wore the same itchy wool tunic your grandpa once wore to bed, you were basically living history. So tonight, as you lie comfortably in your modern pajamas or sleep naked with climate control, think back to those bundled-up monks, breezy peasants, and noble ladies adjusting their silk nightcaps just so. The medieval world may not have agreed on what to wear to bed, but they all knew one truth. Whatever you wore, it had better keep you warm, humble, and possibly demon-proof. You're finally warm, nestled under your scratchy wool blanket, your nightcap slumped sideways, your straw mattress mercifully quiet for once. And then nature calls, but it's pitch black. It's freezing. And the privy? That's outside. Across the courtyard, past the livestock, possibly haunted. This is the part of medieval sleeping life no one wants to think about, but absolutely had to deal with. Midnight bathroom breaks, or rather, the chamber pot dilemma. Let's be blunt. Indoor plumbing wasn't a thing. If you needed to go during the night, you weren't hiking outside in your bare feet and linen shift unless it was a true emergency, and even then, only after crossing yourself 3 times. Instead, people used the chamber pot, a simple, shallow container that lived under the bed, behind a curtain, or next to the hearth. It was your trusty nighttime toilet, assuming no one else got there first. Some chamber pots were made of clay, some of tin or bronze, and wealthier folks had them made of porcelain or even silver. Yes, silver. Imagine relieving yourself into a handcrafted, heirloom-worthy bowl now that's status. Though let's hope you didn't confuse it for a soup tureen the next morning. Still, chamber pots weren't glamorous. They were noisy, smelly, and prone to splashing. Emptying them was a dreaded chore. If you were rich, that job went to a servant known as the gong farmer, a person whose entire existence revolved around waste management. The poor? They did it themselves. Usually first thing in the morning, when you were bleary-eyed and hoping not to spill it on your only pair of shoes. Some homes had a designated spot for dumping the pot, a slop bucket, a drainage channel leading outside, or just the street. Yes, the street. Urban centres in medieval Europe often operated under the out-the-window system. You opened the shutters, shouted something polite like "Gardez l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," and tossed it. The water was not water. Streets ran brown, and you never, ever walked under windows in the morning. But even that was preferable to the privy, or outhouse, which was often just a hole in a wooden bench above a pit. In castles and monasteries, privies were called garderobes, built into the outer walls so waste could fall into the moat or a chute. It kept smells outside, mostly. But on a cold, rainy night, walking to the garderobe was like volunteering to be miserable. There are even records of nobles who had portable chamber pots, more like fancy thrones with lids. Some were designed to look like chairs, with hidden compartments underneath. You'd sit down, do your business, and close the lid like nothing happened. One French king reportedly took his favourite chamber pot everywhere, guarded by a personal attendant. Royal bladder, royal rules. And let's not forget travel. If you were staying at an inn or in someone's home, you might not even have a personal chamber pot. In some cases, you'd be expected to share with strangers. There's no historical record of how people handled that awkward conversation, but we can only imagine. Historians still argue whether people cleaned their chamber pots daily or let them, well, marinate. Diaries and household accounts suggest both. Some folks were fanatically tidy. Others waited until they absolutely had to. And in the summer, the smell could knock a monk flat. There's also evidence that chamber pot placement was strategic. Many households kept them near the fire not for ambience, but to prevent freezing in winter. Yes, frozen waste was a real issue. And trying to empty an ice block of human contents? That's not the kind of medieval history that makes it into the bedtime fairy tales. In fact, the whole situation often led to some creative inventions. One popular workaround was the close stool, a small wooden box with a hole in the top and a chamber pot tucked inside. Covered with cushions and a lid, it doubled as a chair. You might have been offered one while visiting a wealthy household, hopefully after it was emptied. And let's not pretend accidents didn't happen. Medieval linens and mattresses were notoriously hard to clean, and spills were common. The result? A steady market for herbal sachets, perfumed oils, and room incense, all designed to mask the reality of life before flush toilets. So, next time you pad across your heated floor to a brightly lit bathroom, whisper a little thanks to history. You're not gripping a cold handle, praying your pot hasn't frozen shut. You're not dumping waste into the street or arguing over pot-sharing rights with a cranky stranger in the dark. No, you're living in luxury. The kind of luxury a 14th century peasant could only dream of while trying not to pee on their shoes. You finally return to bed, your business with the chamber pot behind you, hopefully quite literally. And just as you begin to drift off, something shifts at your feet, a warm, squirming shape, then a snort, then a cluck? You open your eyes and realize, with medieval clarity, you are not sleeping alone. Welcome to the strange but common reality of animals in the bed. A cozy, chaotic, and occasionally flea-ridden part of medieval life that most history books politely skim over. Let's start with the pets. Dogs and cats were frequent bedmates, especially for the wealthy. Cats were praised for their warmth and their talent at keeping mice at bay. Small dogs, like the medieval turnspit dog or lap dog, were especially prized for curling up beneath the blankets and acting like hot water bottles with fur and attitude. These animals weren't just tolerated in bed, they were invited. Some noble women even had silken pillows embroidered for their pets and slept nose to tail with their loyal companions. In a drafty castle, a snuggly dog was more than emotional support, it was climate control. But pets weren't the only animals sharing the mattress. For peasants, sleep was a group survival strategy, and that included livestock. On cold nights, bringing the family pig or goat inside wasn't a joke, it was a way to stay warm. Pigs, in particular, were known for their body heat, which made them something of a rural radiator. Yes, your sleep might be interrupted by a snuffle, a snort, or a sudden rooting motion, but you wouldn't freeze to death. Small price to pay. And chickens? Oh yes. Free-range chickens often roosted indoors, especially during winter. While they typically preferred beams or perches, it wasn't unheard of for one to find its way under a blanket. Feathered heat, in a pinch. In urban homes, things got even weirder. Rats and mice scurried freely, and keeping a cat in the bed was both affection and pest control. Some sources suggest that cats were even believed to ward off evil spirits, 2 jobs for the price of 1. Now, historians still debate whether these animal companions were universally beloved or just begrudgingly accepted. Some medieval texts speak tenderly of dogs being faithful, warm, and comforting. Others complain of fleas, fur, and that cursed pig snoring like a bishop. But the reality was this: sharing space was survival. Whether you were sleeping on straw or silk, warmth was king, and the line between pet, pest, and pillow was often blurred. Interestingly, some monasteries permitted cats but forbade dogs, fearing the latter brought in worldly noise. Of course, if you've ever heard a cat yowl at 3 a.m, you may question the logic. Either way, monks didn't sleep with animals, though they were often surrounded by them in barns or infirmaries. The upper classes, for all their finery, still lived in homes without central heat or insect screening. Even a noble lady might wake up with a weasel at her feet or a moth in her hair. One courtier wrote of a badger that troubled my sleep, which either meant an unwelcome animal or a metaphor for his in-laws. In some regions, animals weren't just bed companions, they were omens. A dog sleeping with its back to the door? Good luck. A cat leaving the bed at midnight? Bad news. A rooster crowing too early? A sign of witchcraft. Superstition blurred with practicality, creating bedtime rituals involving everything from salt circles to whispered prayers over a piglet's ear. Even kings weren't exempt. Louis XI of France famously kept his favourite greyhound in bed with him, claiming it could sense betrayal. Was the dog comfortable? Probably. Did the servants appreciate changing the royal sheets? Less likely. Of course, not every animal encounter was pleasant. Lice, fleas, and mites thrived in the shared warmth. Entire treatises were written on how to rid your bed of pests, often involving smoke, herbs, or strategic shaking of the linens. If your sleep was disturbed, it might not be by nightmares but by something crawling across your scalp. And let's not forget the soundscape. Between snoring pigs, clucking hens, and scratching mice, medieval bedtime was a symphony of snorts, chirps, and the occasional "get down." Even the wealthiest homes echoed with animal presence. So tonight, as you stretch out in your pet-free or carefully pet-curated bed, savor the quiet. No hooves, no feathers, no muddy paw prints on your pillow. Just you, your blanket, and a deep sigh of appreciation for walls, windows, and a world where your sleep isn't interrupted by something rooting under your ribs. It's deep in the night now. The room is still, the hearth embers glow faintly, and your head is finally sinking into a lumpy pillow that smells like thyme and honestly dust. But there's one last item to put on before sleep can truly begin. Your nightcap. Yes, an actual cap. Tied under the chin, floppy, long, sometimes absurd looking. In medieval Europe, this wasn't just a quirky fashion statement, it was an essential piece of sleepwear, right up there with your chamber pot and flea-chasing herbs. Nightcaps, or sleeping bonnets, were worn by both men and women, especially in cooler climates and during winter months. The main reason? Heat retention. As the old wisdom goes, you lose a lot of body heat through your head. And in the Middle Ages, when windows were drafty, roofs were leaky, and insulation was whatever's growing on the walls, keeping your head warm was a nighttime priority. For men, the typical nightcap was cone-shaped or cylindrical, often knit or sewn from wool or linen, and tied loosely under the chin. Think of it as a cross between a gnome's hat and a soft bucket. Some even had a long tail with a tassel, not for style though it was a vibe, but to wrap around the neck like a scarf for added warmth. Women, on the other hand, often wore bed bonnets made from lighter linen or cotton. These were close-fitting, simple, and tied under the chin. In many households, it was considered improper for a woman to go to bed with her hair uncovered, part modesty, part superstition, part lice deterrent. These bonnets also helped protect hairstyles from flattening, though let's be honest, medieval styling tools were mostly fingers and wishful thinking. And speaking of superstition, nightcaps were also believed to guard against evil spirits. Yes, really. Some people embroidered tiny crosses or magical symbols into the fabric, or sprinkled them with dried herbs like lavender or rosemary. A blessed bonnet, it was thought, could keep nightmares or even demons at bay. Historians still argue whether this belief was widespread or regional. Some claim the protective aspect of nightcaps was limited to rural folk traditions, while others argue that even nobility believed in their apotropaic power. Either way, a nightcap wasn't just for warmth, it was your spiritual helmet for the battlefield of dreams. Now here's a fun, fringe tidbit. In some households, nightcaps were worn all day, especially by the sick or elderly. A person confined to bed might keep their cap on 24/7, not just for heat, but to signify frailty or spiritual devotion. In portraits of scholars or monks, you'll often see these sleepy bonnets perched atop furrowed brows, lending an air of permanent exhaustion. And then there's the decorative side. Wealthy families sometimes embroidered their nightcaps with initials, floral patterns, or even cheeky messages. Imagine lying down with a hat that reads, "Do not disturb dreaming of mead." One surviving example from the 1502 reads, "Jesu mercy, save me now." A bedtime prayer stitched into fabric, just in case. The presence of nightcaps in literature also shows how embedded they were in daily life. From Chaucer to Shakespeare, characters in nightclothes almost always include a cap. In fact, the phrase, "putting on one's nightcap," eventually evolved to refer to both literal bedtime and the last drink of the evening. Two forms of comfort, same name. In group sleeping situations like inns, monasteries, or shared family beds, Nightcap served as a barrier of sorts, a visual sign that I'm off duty now. If your cap was on, you were officially in sleep mode. Do not disturb unless the house is on fire or the pigs are escaping again. But there were drawbacks. Nightcaps could get itchy, tangled, or soaked with sweat, especially if worn too tightly. In warmer months, people sometimes ditched them in favor of lighter cloths, or tied their hair back with ribbon instead. Still, many kept a nightcap nearby, even draped on the bedpost as part of their nightly ritual. And if you're picturing bedtime romance, well, it probably wasn't helped by both parties showing up in long linen gowns and matching head wraps. Let's just say seduction wasn't the goal, sleep was, and not freezing to death. So tonight, as your modern head rests on your hypoallergenic pillow, be thankful for heating, for hair dryers, and for not needing to tie a fabric knot under your chin just to survive the night. But if you ever feel a sudden chill, or sense a bad dream creeping in, maybe reach for a cap. You never know. The medieval folks might have been onto something after all. You hear the bell long before you see the candlelight. A distant chime, soft but steady then again, and again. The sound stirs you, not just from sleep, but from the very edge of dreams. You sit up, groggy, cold, and barefoot on a stone floor. If you were a monk in medieval Europe, this wasn't unusual. In fact, it was scheduled. It's time for matins, your first prayers of the day, even though it's still the dead of night. Monastic life didn't follow a 9 to 5. It followed the divine office, a rigid timetable of prayer and sleep, designed to synchronize the soul with sacred rhythms. For many monks and nuns, that meant a polyphasic sleep schedule broken, disciplined, and far from restful by modern standards. Most monasteries practiced a segmented sleeping routine that began with a few hours of rest in the early evening. Then, in total darkness or by flickering oil lamp, they'd rise for matins or vigils, the first of 8 daily prayer services. Depending on the order, this could start anywhere from 2 o'clock to 3:30 a.m. After prayers, there might be a return to bed for a couple more hours, before Lauds at dawn. The result? A sleep schedule that resembled a spiritual boot camp, designed to mortify the flesh and train the soul. Comfort was not the goal. Obedience, discipline, and devotion were. Monastic dormitories were usually long, echoing halls, lined with simple wooden beds or mats. No curtains, no private space. No cuddling with pigs, dogs, or snoring spouses. Just your fellow brothers or sisters, breathing softly, hopefully without dreaming of anything too earthly. But monks had a secret weapon, the nap. While nighttime sleep was short, structured naps were woven into the day. During the little hours or after midday meals, monks often stole brief moments of rest, sometimes even during long, silent meditations. Some scholars even suggest that sleep during sermons was tolerated, as long as it didn't involve snoring or tipping off the bench. In fact, one order, the Cluniacs, were so strict about nighttime prayers that monks reportedly fell asleep standing up in the chapel. One chronicler even described a monk who nodded off mid-prayer, only to awaken with the entire community still chanting beside him. No judgment, just devotion. And yet, for all their austerity, monks cared deeply about when and how they slept. Some abbeys had written instructions on the ideal posture. Flat on your back, hands crossed on chest, like you're already practicing for your tomb. Others recommended sleeping in your habit, fully clothed, so you could jump out of bed instantly if needed. Of course, not all orders agreed. Benedictines had rules against excessive rest, while Cistercians were known for stripping back even further. No pillows, no sheets, sometimes no fires in winter. Franciscans, ever humble, slept wherever there was room, straw mats, cloister benches, even chapel floors. And yet, in this rigid world, a few quirky comforts crept in. Herbal pouches were sometimes tucked into bedding, lavender for calm, mint for clarity, and rue to ward off evil. One monk famously claimed that his dreams grew holier after tucking rosemary beneath his pillow. Whether this was divine intervention or wishful thinking, historians still argue. Monks weren't the only ones with strange schedules. Nuns, too, rose in the night to chant and pray, though some convents allowed more sleep if duties were light. In smaller or poorer houses, nuns might share beds or rotate between sleep and chapel shifts, maintaining eternal prayer, a rotation known as laus perennis, or unceasing praise. Yet even with such a fragmented routine, monastics viewed sleep not as a loss of time, but as spiritual preparation, a trial, a sacrifice, even a rehearsal for death. In a world where daily life was unpredictable, controlling your night when and how you slept became an act of sacred discipline. One particularly eerie belief? Some monks saw sleep as an opening for demonic attack. That's why prayers before bed were crucial. The phrase, "deliver us from evil," wasn't poetic, it was tactical. You didn't want to drift into dreams without spiritual armor. So, as you lie back tonight, cocooned in silence and not expected to chant psalms at 3 a.m., take a moment to thank the monks. Their schedule was punishing, their beds uncomfortable, and their dreams, well, who knows. But their dedication shaped centuries of sleep habits, some of which, like segmented sleep, may have been more in tune with our natural rhythms than we realize. And if you wake up in the dark, confused and alert, know this: you're not broken. You're just on monk time. You're awake again. The fire has gone out completely, and a soft hush hangs in the air like breath suspended between two heartbeats. But you're not alarmed, because this, strangely, is normal. In medieval times, waking in the middle of the night wasn't a disruption. It was expected. In fact, this period was sometimes considered the most sacred hour of all. Welcome to the world of the midnight vigil, a slice of consciousness nestled between your first sleep and second sleep. For many, this waking window was a gift, a pocket of time between darkness and dawn that felt somehow outside of time itself. During this quiet interval, typically lasting an hour or two, people would get up, tend the fire, stretch, pray, or simply sit in silence. It was a soft, meditative wakefulness, not the buzzing insomnia of modern life. The body was calm, the mind was lucid, and the spirit was believed to be closest to God. Religious people used the vigil to pray or read scripture. Devotional books like the Book of Hours were designed with midnight prayers in mind. The belief was that at this hour, the veil between heaven and earth grew thinner, and the prayers you whispered might travel farther, faster. But it wasn't all candles and contemplation. The midnight hours were also used for everyday tasks: mending clothes, preparing food, even intimate relations between spouses. Some scholars argue this window was the preferred time for conception. There are medical texts from the 15th century that outright recommend after the first sleep as the ideal time, citing improved vitality and settled humors. You know, very romantic stuff. This strange window between sleeps appears in countless medieval documents, from letters to sermons to court records. People referred to it as the watch, or simply the waking. It wasn't just for monks. Farmers, bakers, tailors, everyone knew about this pocket of night. It was so ordinary that people didn't even question it. Modern sleep scientists call this biphasic sleep, and they believe it might actually be our body's natural rhythm, disrupted only in the last few centuries by artificial lighting and rigid work schedules. In other words, if you wake up at 2 a.m. feeling oddly serene, you're more medieval than you think. Some even used the vigil to visit neighbors. Imagine that, strolling over to someone's house at 1:30 the morning, knocking gently, and being welcomed in for quiet conversation over a shared candle. There was no Netflix, no phone to scroll, just the sound of your own breath and maybe some gentle gossip about that weird thing the blacksmith said at the market. Of course, there was also an air of mystery to this time. Darkness had its dangers. Thieves, spirits, wolves, who could say what walked between midnight and morning? Superstitions flourished. Some believed that dreams born in the midnight hours were prophetic and should be recorded or told to a wise elder. Others feared that waking at the wrong moment meant you had been disturbed by something unnatural. In folklore, the vigil was also a time when the dead might stir, or witches wandered. One tale from rural England describes a man who always lit his candle during the watch and never left bed without whispering a protective prayer. Why? Because once, when he didn't, he swore he saw a white dog with human eyes sitting by his chamber door. He never made that mistake again. Still, the vigil wasn't usually frightening. It was more like an intermission, a chance to sit quietly beside the fire, watch the smoke curl upward, and reflect. Some even believed it was the best time to make decisions, as your mind was free from the noise of the day and the distractions of dawn. Historians still argue whether this pattern disappeared naturally or was forced out by the Industrial Revolution. As artificial light extended the day and work schedules became more demanding, people started pushing sleep into a single, long stretch. The idea of a nighttime intermission was labeled as restlessness or insomnia, when really it might just have been tradition. And so the midnight vigil faded. Candles were replaced by clocks. Silence was replaced by schedules. But for centuries, that quiet, still hour tucked between two worlds was cherished. So tonight, if you wake and lie quietly in the dark, don't panic. You're not broken. You're just returning to a medieval rhythm. Take a breath. Watch the shadows on the ceiling. You're part of a tradition that stretches back 1,000 years. Let the house rest. Let the world hush. And when you're ready, you'll slip gently into your second sleep, just like they used to. You shift on your straw mattress, eyes half-lidded in the candlelight, but something's off. Your limbs ache. Your mind won't quiet. You try to sleep, but the rest won't come. Congratulations, you're having medieval insomnia, a surprisingly common and widely misunderstood nightly ordeal. But don't worry. In the year 1374, you've got options. Before prescription pills and melatonin gummies, people turned to an arsenal of weird and wonderful sleep aids, ranging from the charmingly herbal to the downright bizarre. If it sounds like something your grandmother might have tried, you're probably not far off. First up, the herbal pillow. No medieval sleeper worth their salt went to bed without a sachet of dried flowers and leaves tucked beneath or inside the pillowcase. The most popular herbs? Lavender, chamomile, rosemary, and hops. Yes, the same stuff used in beer was believed to bring on drowsiness either because of its mild sedative qualities or because the smell reminded people of drinking until they passed out. For the truly elite, pillows might be stuffed entirely with herbs. Imagine laying your head on a blend of mint, thyme, rose petals, and lavender sewn into linen. It sounds soothing until you consider the likelihood of bugs, mold, or one of your housemates mistaking it for a salad. And if that didn't work, try onions. One folk remedy involved slicing a raw onion and placing it on the soles of your feet, wrapped in cloth, before bedtime. Supposedly, it drew bad humours out of the body and allowed restful sleep. Modern science is skeptical. Your spouse, even more so. Feeling restless still? Then it's time for a good old-fashioned incantation. Many people in the Middle Ages believed sleep was a gift from the divine, or something easily stolen by demons. Whispering a protective charm or prayer before bed was part of nightly routine for countless households. A popular one translated roughly to, "In the name of Christ I close mine eyes. May no demon or ill wind disturb my rest." You'll find versions of this in Christian, Jewish, and even pagan traditions. It wasn't superstition, it was security. For more stubborn insomnia, a medieval apothecary might suggest something a little stronger, a draught of poppy syrup containing opiates, or an infusion of lettuce water. Yes, lettuce. It was boiled, strained, and served warm, believed to have cooling properties that calmed the mind. Did it work? Possibly. Did it taste awful? Absolutely. One medieval doctor even recommended smearing goose fat on the chest to soothe nighttime anxiety. Another swore by rabbit brain powder, mixed with wine. And no, we're not making that up. Historians still argue whether these methods were based on trial and error, or deeply held spiritual beliefs. Likely both. The humoral theory dominated medieval medicine, and sleeplessness was blamed on an imbalance of internal fluids, usually too much hot and dry humor, which made the brain overactive. Cool, wet remedies were the solution. Another clever but strange remedy? Listening to soft, repetitive stories. It's true people believed that certain kinds of gentle, rhythmic storytelling could lull the mind into sleep. This might explain why religious texts, moral tales, and lengthy family histories were often recited aloud at bedtime. If you've ever been read a long-winded genealogy and nodded off halfway through, you get the idea. And then there were physical solutions. Some folks rocked themselves to sleep, not just children, but adults too. Cradle-like beds existed, and gentle rocking was considered a calming motion, mimicking the safety of the womb. Others simply swayed while seated until they nodded off, which probably led to a lot of bruised foreheads. For children, mothers often sang lullabies filled with protection spells, invoking saints, angels, and even animals to guard the child from evil dreams. One 15th century lullaby translated as, "Sleep, my lamb, St. Michael stands, sword in hand." Talk about cozy with a side of caution. Still not out? Then you might turn to bedtime rituals involving objects, touching a crucifix, kissing a relic, or placing a stone under the pillow carved with symbols of sleep. Some believed moonstones or amber could absorb restless energy. Others used carved wood with Latin inscriptions. And of course, alcohol was often a last resort. A mug of warmed ale or mulled wine at bedtime was common, particularly among the working class. It relaxed the body, dulled the senses, and knocked you out cold. Problem solved until the next morning's headache. So tonight, as you lie in your memory foam cocoon, consider how far we've come. No onions on your feet, no goose fat rub-downs, no demonic interference, hopefully. Just you, your breathing, and maybe a whisper of lavender from your pillow mist. But if sleep still won't come, don't fight it. Light a candle in your mind. Picture an herb-filled room, a soft wool blanket, and the sound of your grandmother whispering a prayer over you. You're not alone in your struggle. You're just another tired soul in a long medieval line of dream chasers. The sun beams high over the village green, kids are laughing, chickens are chasing each other in circles, and there you are, face down in the hay, drooling. A sweet little afternoon nap, right? Well, in medieval Europe, not kite. Napping during daylight hours was a surprisingly controversial topic in the Middle Ages. To some, it was a harmless break from toil. To others, particularly clergy and moralists, it was seen as a sin, a waste of time, even a gateway to temptation. That innocent midday snooze could mark you as slothful, or worse, suspiciously idle. Let's break it down. In theory, medieval society valued hard work, discipline, and piety. The 7 deadly sins weren't just sermon filler, they were a lifestyle guide. And sloth was right there in the lineup, sandwiched between greed and wrath. Taking an unnecessary nap in the middle of the day? That was flirting with spiritual danger. Historians still argue whether naps were officially condemned by the church, or just socially frowned upon by certain groups. What we do know is that many monastic rules explicitly regulated rest. For example, in the Rule of St. Benedict, naps were only allowed under certain conditions, like old age, illness, or extreme fatigue. No lazy monks allowed. But outside of cloisters, real life got messier. The truth is, most medieval people did nap, especially those doing hard labor. Farmers, herders, bakers, blacksmiths, anyone who rose before dawn and toiled in the fields until sunset likely grabbed a few stolen moments of sleep in the shade, especially in the afternoon heat. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival. In cities, merchants and artisans often took short breaks too, though they might nap at their shop benches, slumped against sacks of grain or scraps of leather. And for women working the home, cooking, sewing, raising kids, napping might mean stealing a moment of peace while the stew simmered and the baby finally stopped crying. But here's the twist. Napping was often associated with wealth and luxury. If you had enough free time to nap, that meant someone else was doing your work. In royal courts or noble houses, a midday repose was built into the day. Nobles would retire after lunch, draw the bed curtains, and snooze in embroidered bliss. In this context, napping wasn't sinful, it was stylish. Some even had special daybeds or cushioned benches just for this purpose. A siesta, by any other name, but with more fur trim. Meanwhile, peasants caught napping in public could be ridiculed or, depending on the town, punished. Local laws sometimes forbade idling during work hours, which included sleeping in alleys or public greens. Was it about productivity? Maybe. Or maybe it was about appearances. Being asleep in the wrong place made you look like a vagrant, or worse, a drunkard. And then there was the link to lust. Medieval texts sometimes warned that daytime sleep made the body lazy and the mind open to temptation. One 14th century preacher wrote that those who doze at day, sin in dream, and wake in want. A bit dramatic, but you get the idea. Nap at your own risk. Still, there were defenders of the daytime doze. Physicians believed that short rests helped digest meals, especially after heavy midday feasts. Manuals of health, like the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, suggested lying on your right side after lunch to ease the belly and calm the spirits. So if anyone judged you, you could say you were just being medically responsible. Some medieval doctors even prescribed naps as cures for headaches, melancholy, or excessive study. Students in universities like Oxford or Paris were known to nap between lectures, though sometimes that nap happened during the lecture if the professor droned on too long about Aristotle. Let's not forget the holy naps, too. Certain saints were said to receive divine visions during brief midday sleeps. St. Francis reportedly napped while lying in the grass and claimed to hear angels singing. Whether this was divine revelation or heat stroke is still debated. And yes, children napped freely. There's no historical record of scolding toddlers for falling asleep on a sack of flour. Most communities understood that kids needed rest, and mothers often used lullabies and gentle rocking to coax them into afternoon slumber. The only complaint? That they sometimes woke up crankier than before. So what's the takeaway? Like most things medieval, context mattered. Nap in a noble bed? Chic. Nap in a public square? Scandalous. Nap because your back aches from tilling a field since 4 a.m? Understandable. Just don't let the priest catch you. As you settle into your modern sofa for a guilt-free afternoon nap, think about those who came before. The labourers who curled under haystacks, the monks who fought drowsiness in the chapel, the scholars who dozed with ink-stained fingers. They slept, just like you. A little judged, perhaps, but still deeply human. So go ahead. Close your eyes. You've earned this one. You dream of a quiet field, a sunlit chapel, maybe a feast, but then something shifts. You feel watched. Not by a person, but by something deeper. You wake in the dark, unsettled. In medieval Europe, that wasn't just a bad dream, it could be a message, or worse, a warning. To the medieval mind, dreams were never just dreams. They were signs, portents, divine communications, or demonic temptations. Every flicker of your subconscious was studied like a sermon, and depending on who you asked, your midnight visions could mean everything or doom. Let's start with the holy side. Many believed dreams were God's way of speaking to the faithful. Think of Joseph in the Bible, interpreting Pharaoh's dreams or receiving angelic messages in sleep. Medieval clergy clung to these examples, encouraging believers to view certain dreams as prophetic or instructional. Books like the Somniale Danielis, a popular dream manual circulating in monasteries, offered extensive indexes of dream symbols. Dream of a dove? Divine peace. A snake? Deceit or the devil. A broken shoe? Trouble in marriage. Losing teeth? Well, you'd better prepare for death, taxes, or both. These interpretations weren't treated lightly. Some rulers even kept dream interpreters on hand, seeking advice before battles or major decisions. And monks were known to record particularly vivid dreams in prayer journals, viewing them as spiritual whispers. But dreams didn't always come from heaven. In fact, many people feared they came from much darker places. Nightmares weren't just unpleasant, they were dangerous. A terrifying dream might indicate possession, witchcraft, or a visit from a demon, especially if accompanied by paralysis, pressure on the chest, or the sensation of suffocation. Sound familiar? That's because many accounts of demonic visitations at night align almost perfectly with what we now call sleep paralysis. The feeling of being awake but unable to move, often with hallucinations of shadowy figures, was widespread across Europe, and the explanation was rarely scientific. Instead, people blamed incubi, male demons, or succubi, female demons, for these encounters. These creatures were said to attack sleepers, particularly women, draining them of energy or tempting them into sinful dreams. Victims might wake with unexplained bruises or fatigue, convinced they had been visited by evil in the night. Historians still debate whether these tales were folklore, metaphor for trauma, or genuine attempts to explain sleep disorders. Likely, it was a messy mix of all three. But one thing's for sure, people believed, and they took measures. To protect against demonic dreams, sleepers would hang crucifixes, sprinkle holy water, or sleep with a consecrated charm under the pillow. Some even drank herbal tonics, or recited psalms as a kind of spiritual sleep aid. And if things got truly dire, they might call for a priest to bless the bedroom and cast out whatever foul spirit was thought to linger. On a more mundane level, even normal dreams could be deeply judged. To dream of food? Gluttony. To dream of lustful acts? Sin. You were expected to confess impure dreams just as you would real-life misdeeds. Some confessional guides even had entire sections devoted to dream-based sins, which sounds like a nightmare in its own right. But not all dreams were so serious. In folk traditions, dreams also served as connections to the dead. If a loved one appeared in your sleep, it might mean they had unfinished business, or simply wanted to say goodbye. In rural areas, families told stories of ghosts appearing in dreams, warning of danger, or asking for prayers. Dreams also played a role in local healing practices. Wise women or village healers would sometimes interpret dreams to diagnose illnesses or prescribe remedies. Dreamed of drowning? A problem with the lungs. Dreamed of fire? Too much heat in the body, try a cold compress and fewer onions. Children's dreams were often dismissed, but sometimes considered spiritually significant, especially if the child was thought to be touched by God. There are even medieval records of child saints who received visions in dreams, later canonized for their nighttime prophecies. And then there were the dreams that made no sense at all. Wild, abstract visions, talking animals, flying, falling. Most people chalked these up to bad digestion, evil humors, or sleeping on the wrong side. There was even a belief that eating too much cheese before bed led to nightmarish hallucinations, a theory still debated by cheese lovers today. So tonight, when your eyes flutter shut and your mind begins to wander, remember this. Your dreams were once sacred, suspicious, and scrutinized. They were warnings and wonders, feared and followed. You are not just sleeping. You are traveling a quiet passenger on an invisible journey that has stirred imaginations for 1,000 years. Sleep gently, and if you dream of a snake, maybe write it down, just in case. It's quiet again, or at least it should be. But then it starts. A soft rasping, then a deep, warbling groan, then a full-body eruption of sound that rattles the walls. No, it's not a ghost. It's snoring, and in medieval Europe, this wasn't just an annoyance, it was something sinister. Snoring was common, of course. People have been rattling the rafters in their sleep since time began, but in the Middle Ages, a particularly loud or irregular snore could raise more than eyebrows, it could raise questions. Was the person simply tired, sick, or was their soul being fought over by unseen forces? Let's start with the medical explanation. Yes, they had one. Some medieval physicians believed snoring was caused by an imbalance of humours, particularly excess phlegm blocking the throat. The solution? Purging, bloodletting, or sleeping at a specific angle with your mouth closed. Sound fun? It wasn't, especially if your physician had shaky hands and a dull knife. And if medicine didn't work? There were always folk cures. One common remedy was to stuff parsley or rosemary up the nostrils before bed. Another suggested binding the jaw shut with linen to train the mouth to stay closed. You know, just in case you were feeling too relaxed at bedtime. Still, not everyone believed snoring was a medical problem. In many communities, it was seen as a spiritual disturbance. A sleeper who snored violently might be under spiritual attack, possessed, or vulnerable to demonic influence. Stories circulated of villagers who snored so loud they were said to shake the spirits from the rafters. One tale from 13th century France describes a man whose snores sounded like cries of the damned. His neighbours called. A priest. He was fine, just congested. Even monks weren't immune. Some monastic orders had strict silence policies, and snoring disrupted that peace. In particularly strict abbeys, repeat offenders were made to sleep in separate quarters or even confess their loudness during communal reflection. Imagine standing in front of your brothers and whispering, "Forgive me, Father, for I honked like a goose last night." And let's not forget the social toll of snoring. In group sleeping arrangements where you might share a bed with relatives, travellers, or half the village snoring was both a personal betrayal and a public nuisance. You couldn't just roll over and groan. You had to endure, or get creative. Some households developed codes of conduct around snoring. The offender might be nudged with a stick, gently rolled onto their side, or even relocated to a bench or the cold floor until they quieted down. In inns, travellers often paid extra for snore-free rooms, which rarely lived up to the promise. And then there's the deeper layer. Snoring was sometimes viewed as a moral flaw. Medieval sermons occasionally linked loud, unrepentant snoring with spiritual laziness or gluttony, as if the sleeper were too indulgent, too relaxed, too far gone in the flesh. One preacher even warned that he who snores deeply has feasted sinfully. Historians still debate whether this association was widespread or merely rhetorical flair, but it reflects a broader anxiety. Sleep wasn't just physical rest. It was a battleground of the soul. Snoring made you vulnerable, weak, open to ridicule, or worse, open to visitation. Some folklore even held that snoring drew spirits, that the sound invited attention from wandering ghosts or demons who mistook it for cries or chants. Parents warned their children to sleep quietly, lest they draw something in through the open mouth. And yet, for all the drama, people still snored. Of course they did. After a day of hauling carts, ploughing fields, or chanting psalms, who wouldn't? So how did they cope? Some families kept soothing sounds in the bedroom, a trickling fountain, a fire crackling in the hearth, or a hanging bell that chimed with the breeze. These white noise substitutes helped muffle the sonic assaults. Others used pillow herbs like thyme, marjoram, and sage believed to ease breathing and settle the chest. And then there were the saints. Certain holy figures were believed to protect against nocturnal noise and breathing trouble. A whispered prayer to Saint Vitus or Saint Blaise, patron of throat ailments, might be said before bed in hopes of a quieter night. Still, snorers weren't pariahs. They were just loud. And medieval folks, for all their quirks, understood that everyone made noise in the dark, whether it was a prayer, a cough, or a long, low honk that sounded like a possessed accordion. So tonight, if you or someone near you starts snoring, don't panic. Don't reach for the rosemary. Just smile, roll over, and remember, in the grand cathedral of medieval sleep, there was always someone rattling the rafters. You're sound asleep. Everything is peaceful until it isn't. You feel a weight on your chest. You try to move, but can't. Your eyes open, but nothing else responds. There's a presence in the room. Something watching. Something pressing. In medieval Europe, this wasn't called a medical episode. It was a visit from a demon. Say hello to night terrors and incubi, a category of medieval sleep disturbances wrapped in terror, myth, and some of the most chilling bedtime stories in history. Today, we might call it sleep paralysis, a well-documented phenomenon where your brain wakes before your body, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. But in the Middle Ages, when science was limited and imagination was vast, this experience was interpreted through a very different lens. The most infamous explanation? The incubus and succubus, male and female demons, respectively, believed to creep into bedrooms and attack people in their sleep, not just spiritually, but physically. Incubi were said to sit on the sleeper's chest, draining energy, or tempting them into impure dreams. Succubi, the same idea, only reversed beautiful, seductive spirits, often blamed for everything from exhaustion to unexplained pregnancies. And these weren't just whispered tales in taverns. Entire theological treatises were written about incubi and succubi. Even famous figures like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas weighed in, debating whether these demons were real beings or manifestations of temptation. Spoiler: they leaned toward real. These creatures weren't confined to fantasy. Villagers told stories of people wasting away, pale and sleepless, haunted night after night. In some cases, entire towns believed a particular house or person was cursed by nightly demonic visits. The solution? Prayer, holy water, or, if things got really bad, exorcism. And the terrifying detail that made these stories so convincing? The physical symptoms. People who experienced these episodes described exactly what sleep paralysis sufferers still report today. A crushing weight, paralysis, intense fear, and the feeling of a presence in the room. Only they didn't call it a REM cycle glitch. They called it evil. Historians still argue whether these tales were simply misunderstood natural phenomena or shaped by religious and cultural fears. Probably both. After all, when the night is long, the fire is low, and you wake frozen with terror, logic isn't always the first tool your brain reaches for. Nightmares were treated with just as much seriousness. A bad dream might not be just a bad dream, it could be a warning, a message, or evidence of spiritual attack. Certain dreams were believed to foreshadow illness, disaster, or even death. Dream of a black dog? A relative may be close to dying. Dream of fire? Trouble is coming. Wake screaming? You'd better pray, and maybe light a candle. To protect against such terrors, medieval people took precautions. One common strategy was to place protective symbols above or around the bed, crosses, amulets, or carvings of saints. Saint Michael, the great demon slayer, was a popular figure for bedroom icons. Others kept iron objects under the bed, which were believed to repel spirits and fey folk. Still others turned to herbs. Valerian root, mugwort, and hyssop were commonly burned, or placed under pillows to ward off nightmares. Some even stitched charms into their pillowcases, hoping the symbols would act like shields during sleep. Even architecture played a role. Some beds were intentionally positioned away from doorways and windows to prevent spirits from passing over the sleeper. A few households went as far as drawing chalk circles or holy lines around their beds before sleep, just in case. Of course, not everyone was protected. Women, children, and those considered weak of faith were seen as more vulnerable to nocturnal attacks. In some tragic cases, people who suffered repeated sleep terrors were labelled as possessed or suspected of consorting with witches. And speaking of witches, the link between sleep and witchcraft ran deep. It was believed that witches entered homes invisibly during the night to sit on chests, steal breath, or even ride sleeping bodies like horses. Yes, you read that right. There are actual court records of people accusing neighbours of riding them in the night, leaving them exhausted and bruised. One famous term born of these fears? The nightmare. It originally referred not to a bad dream, but to the mare, a malevolent spirit or hag that suffocated people in their sleep. The word eventually evolved into its modern usage, but its roots are dark, gasping, and very medieval. So tonight, as you curl under the covers, safe in your modern bed with locks, lights, and perhaps a cat standing guard, remember this. Centuries ago, people stared into the darkness and saw things, felt things that science only recently began to explain. But if you do wake up tonight, frozen in fear, unable to breathe, with a shadow at the edge of your vision, don't panic. You're not cursed. You're just human. Still, maybe keep a little salt by your pillow. You know, just in case. It's morning. Or is it? The light outside is still grey, the air damp with fog. You feel groggy, but oddly energized. You sit up except your shoes are gone. Your legs ache. There's mud on your feet. And someone in the village swears they saw you walking through the field last night, eyes wide, face blank. Welcome to the unsettling world of medieval sleepwalking, a phenomenon viewed with a mix of awe, terror, and a heavy dose of confusion. Today, we know sleepwalking as a parasomnia, a sleep disorder involving complex behaviors during deep sleep. But in medieval Europe, no one had that vocabulary. Instead, a sleepwalker was caught somewhere between the physical and the supernatural, the living and the otherworldly. In some villages, sleepwalking was seen as a spiritual condition, a sign that the soul was wandering while the body tagged along. It was believed that during sleep, a person's soul could leave the body either to explore, visit the divine, or be tempted by darker forces. If the body followed, well, that was cause for concern. Historians still argue whether sleepwalking was seen as dangerous or mystical. In some parts of Europe, those who walked at night were believed to be under the influence of angels or demons. A child seen sleepwalking might be considered touched by God, a possible visionary. An adult, more likely possessed or bewitched. There are records of people wandering for miles in their sleep, across fields, through forests, and even along the edges of rivers and cliffs. One 14th century tale describes a man who was found waist-deep in a pond, muttering prayers with his eyes closed. He had no memory of the event, but the villagers were convinced he had been led astray by a spirit. And yes, sometimes these stories ended in tragedy. Falling into wells, getting lost in woods, walking into enemy camps, there's no shortage of accidents attributed to sleepwalking in medieval texts. One chronicler grimly noted, "He left his bed in silence and was never seen again." What caused it? Theories abounded. Some physicians blamed melancholic humours, especially an excess of black bile. Others said it was a bad alignment of stars, or the result of eating too much heavy food like cheese or beans before bed. "Let no man eat cabbage after sunset," warned one French herbalist, "lest he rise and wander." Sound advice, cabbage, wise or otherwise. Some healers believed sleepwalking was connected to dreams, especially ones left unfinished. If you dreamed of walking to church but woke up halfway through the dream, your body might finish the journey for you later that night. Sort of like a mystical to-do list that your legs remembered but your brain forgot. The remedies were creative, to say the least. One popular method involved tying red thread around the sleeper's wrist, with a sprig of sage or rosemary tucked beneath their pillow. Others hung iron keys above the bed, believing the metal would anchor the soul inside the body. More extreme solutions? You bet. Some people tried exorcisms, especially if the sleepwalker seemed tormented or repeated the same path every night. One priest claimed to have banished a demon that made a boy climb onto the church roof nightly in his sleep. It worked, although suspiciously. So did locking the boy's bedroom door. In more superstitious towns, sleepwalkers were feared. If you were known to wander at night, people might whisper that you were cursed, or worse, a werewolf, yes, really. The belief was that your soul's midnight travels could leave the body open to animal spirits. Some even claimed to see sleepers growl or crawl on all fours, further stoking lycanthropic rumours. Still, not every account was sinister. In some cases, sleepwalking was treated with curiosity, even compassion. Families would gently guide the walker back to bed, careful not to wake them, a tradition that persists even today. Why? Medieval wisdom claimed that waking a sleepwalker could trap their soul outside the body, leading to madness or death. And not just humans were believed to walk in their sleep. Some stories tell of horses galloping without guidance in the dead of night, or dogs chasing unseen prey, evidence, perhaps, that animals too had restless spirits. For those desperate for a cure, one unlikely option was cold water. Not a splash, a full-on soaking. The idea was to shock the body awake and scare the soul back into place. It worked, sometimes. Other times, it just left someone wet, confused, and very annoyed. But perhaps the most haunting element of medieval sleepwalking was the sense of not being in control. In a world obsessed with sin, morality, and self-discipline, the idea that your body could betray you, wander without your consent, your knowledge, your soul was terrifying. So tonight, as you tuck in, take comfort in knowing that your midnight restlessness isn't a demonic affliction. If you wake with muddy feet or stories of strange movements, you don't need a priest or a bucket of cold water. You just need rest and maybe fewer beans. The door creaks open, and you step cautiously into a stone chamber. There's no fire, just a wooden chair, tilted backward against the wall. A wool blanket hangs limply over its arm. You stare at it for a moment, then realize this was the bed. In times of plague and sickness, especially during the great waves of disease in the 14th century, the rules of sleep changed, sometimes drastically. One of the strangest shifts? People began sleeping upright. Not just for convenience, but out of genuine fear that lying flat would invite death. It may sound dramatic, but for a medieval mind, it made perfect sense. The world was collapsing under the weight of the Black Death, and people clung to any idea that might provide protection. Among them was the belief that lying flat, especially on your back, made you more vulnerable to the bad air or miasma that was thought to carry illness. This wasn't just folk belief. Physicians of the time, operating under humoral theory, argued that bodily vapors could rise too quickly when the body was horizontal, overwhelming the heart and lungs. The solution? Elevate the head. Prop yourself up, breathe high. And so, chairs became beds. Not just any chairs, but what historians now call sleeping chairs. High-backed, often with armrests, sometimes angled just enough to let the sleeper slump into a doze. In wealthier homes, these were cushioned and placed near hearths. In poor cottages, they were simple wooden planks, but still preferable to a deathbed. Some slept this way only when ill. Others adopted it full-time, especially during times of outbreak. Entire families were known to sit upright through the night, bundled in cloaks and propped against walls, with the hope that posture might preserve life. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was isolated to urban centres, where disease spread rapidly. Others suggest it became common enough to alter furniture design. In any case, there's no question that sleeping upright became a symbol of caution and often desperation. And yet, it wasn't entirely impractical. For those suffering from respiratory illnesses, sleeping upright did bring relief. Whether the plague or a chronic lung infection, elevation helped clear the chest, reduce coughing, and ease breathing. Medieval people didn't have oxygen tanks, but they had gravity. Some even added makeshift padding to their chairs, rolled blankets, cloaks, or sacks of grain to support the spine. In monasteries and infirmaries, infirm monks were given designated upright rest stations, where attendants would monitor breathing and offer herbal tonics. A popular one? Vinegar-steamed cloths pressed to the chest, believed to draw out corruption. Another involved rosemary oil rubbed on the temples and under the nose. These were paired with whispered prayers to Saint Sebastian, patron saint of plague victims. Of course, not all upright sleeping was disease-related. Some people chose to sleep this way for spiritual reasons. Certain mystics believed lying down was too indulgent, that sleep should be a half-wakeful meditation. Some even tied themselves to chairs or leaned into corners to keep from collapsing. Rest was a privilege. Being prepared to die even in sleep was holy. This belief spilled over into death rituals as well. In some cultures, people propped up the dying in their final moments so they could pass while facing heaven, not the ceiling. The idea was to leave this world with open eyes, not closed ones. And yet, for all its somber associations, sleeping upright was also practical during mass illness. Hospitals were overflowing, beds were limited, and space was sacred. A chair took up less room than a cot. In some plague-ridden towns, families built bed chairs that could be tucked into corners, passed from patient to patient. Even kings weren't spared. King Edward III's court reportedly used upright sleep as a precaution during outbreaks, instructing nobles to rest seated and veiled until danger passed. Whether this helped is unclear, but it certainly looked dramatic. One lesser-known but fascinating note: people started creating plague nightwear, long robes with stiff collars, hats that kept the head upright, and even neck props made from carved wood or bundled straw. You didn't lie down, you leaned. And if you slid too far, the chair reminded you gently or not that the flatness of death was only inches away. Of course, once the worst of the plague waves receded, people slowly returned to their beds. But some habits lingered. Elderly or ill individuals often continued to sleep upright out of custom or lingering fear, and the idea that lying flat was somehow unnatural or dangerous persisted for centuries. So tonight, as you recline at a luxurious angle on your mattress, take a moment to consider the chairs of the past, the stiff wood, the scratchy wool, the deep, bone-deep hope that sitting up might ward off the darkness. And if you ever wake in your comfy bed with a pillow behind your head and a comforter snug around your chest, know this: you're not just sleeping, you're defying history. The torchlight flickers along the carved stone walls. You pass 2 guards and a yawning servant before stepping into a room perfumed with rosewater and beeswax. The bed? It's more elaborate than anything you've ever seen. 6 feet high, draped in velvet, trimmed in gold, and surrounded by 4 silent attendants. Welcome to the bedtime of royalty. Sleeping like a king in the Middle Ages wasn't just about rest. It was a ritual, a symbol of status, and often a bit of a performance. From scented linens to ceremonial disrobing, royal sleep routines were designed not only for comfort, but for authority. Let's start with the centerpiece, the bed itself. For nobles and monarchs, beds were opulent beyond reason. Carved from hardwoods like walnut or oak, they stood tall and wide, with 4 heavy posts supporting a canopy and curtains that could be drawn shut like stage drapes. These weren't just decorative, they protected the sleeper from drafts, insects, and, occasionally, assassins. In some cases, the bed wasn't even used for sleep. Instead, It served as a throne of intimacy, a place for receiving close advisors, family members, or favored guests. Picture the king reclining against silk pillows, discussing diplomacy while being handed grapes. Yes, really. Royal beds were so valuable, they were passed down through generations, gifted between kingdoms, and even itemized in treaties. When Queen Elizabeth I travelled, her own bed was broken down, transported in pieces, and reassembled at her destination like a very regal IKEA set. But the real spectacle came at nightfall. The royal going-to-bed ceremony, especially in French and English courts, was an actual event, known as the coucher. It involved a carefully choreographed process. Attendants undressing the monarch, adjusting bedclothes, lighting candles, and preparing nightcaps and herbal tonics. Historians still debate whether this ceremony was truly practical or simply a performance of power. Likely, it was both. The coucher reinforced the idea that even sleep was governed by the crown. If the king didn't rest well, neither did the kingdom. These rituals could be deeply intimate. In some courts, only the most trusted attendants were allowed to draw the bed curtains or hand over the linen shirt. In others, the monarch would speak a final blessing or prayer aloud before being left alone. The idea was not just to ensure rest, but to mark the transition from ruler to vulnerable human, if only for a few hours. And what of sleep itself? Well, royalty didn't sleep alone. Not always, anyway. While many monarchs had private rooms, they often shared beds with consorts, advisors, or even children, depending on the occasion. Sometimes a bed was shared with a body servant, tasked with being nearby in case the king or queen needed anything. Yes, even at 2 a.m. If you were nobility or high-ranking clergy, you might also be invited to sleep over at the royal court. But don't picture giggles and pillow fights. Your chamber assignment said everything about your political standing. Closer room to the royal bedroom? Favourable. Stuck next to the kitchens? Better start writing some flattery. Royal bedding was extravagant. Sheets of fine linen, blankets of wool or fur, pillows filled with down, and coverlets embroidered with gold thread. Some monarchs preferred fragrant sachets, sewn into the pillows lavender, rose, cloves to scent their sleep. Others demanded specific sleep postures. King Henry VIII, for example, was said to lie on his left side, with one hand resting on a dagger beneath his pillow. Security, after all, didn't stop at the chamber door. Monarchs were vulnerable while asleep, so guards were often posted outside, or even inside the bedchamber. Some kings and queens insisted on multiple locks on the door, and special signals or codes to alert them if someone entered unannounced. The queen's sleeping arrangements were no less meticulous. In fact, queenly sleep routines often involved handmaidens, prayers, elaborate hair arrangements, and the occasional midnight snack. There's a lovely account of a duchess who ate candied almonds and honeyed dates every night before bed, delivered in a silver bowl with a single candle. Extravagant? Yes. But digestion was serious business in the medieval world. Still, even royal sleep was subject to the limits of the era. Drafts, lice, sickness, and nightmares didn't care about titles. Many monarchs struggled with insomnia, chronic pain, or just plain discomfort, especially when wearing elaborate sleeping garments meant more for status than actual rest. Yet bedtime was also a moment of vulnerability, and that made it sacred. In some royal courts, priests or confessors were brought in before bed, offering blessings or hearing final thoughts in case the monarch didn't wake. Sleep was close to death, after all, and kings were no more immortal than the servants who folded their sheets. So tonight, as you slide under your covers in solitude, consider the kings and queens of old curtained in velvet, perfumed with rosewater, watched over by candlelight and silent guards. They may have ruled the world by day, but at night, like everyone else, they simply hoped for rest. You wake up in your humble cottage, bones stiff from the straw-filled mattress, and stretch. Across the village, the Lord's Tower glimmers in the morning light. He's probably still in bed, the bed that weighs more than your entire house. Because in the Middle Ages, a bed wasn't just for sleep. It was a status symbol. Today, we think of beds as private, practical, and, hopefully, comfortable. But in medieval society, especially among the wealthy, the bed was a kind of stage, a statement piece meant to show wealth, taste, and authority. If your bed could survive a siege, you were clearly someone worth listening to. Let's start with the construction. A peasant's bed, if they had one at all, was often no more than a wooden platform or pallet laid directly on the floor. Maybe some hay, maybe a rough wool blanket. But the nobility? Their beds were towering marvels, sometimes over 6 feet tall, complete with carved headboards, turned posts, footstools, and heavy drapes that could transform sleep into ceremony. A canopy bed called a tester bed was the ultimate flex. These weren't just decorative. The canopy and curtains provided insulation, privacy, and even protection from falling debris or insects in drafty stone castles. A well-dressed bed could cost as much as a farm. Beds were so valuable that they were bequeathed in wills. To my eldest son, I leave the lands. To my daughter, the feather bed with green velvet curtains. Owning such a bed could elevate your social status literally. If you had a bed frame, people knew your name. Even the bedding itself carried prestige. Linen sheets? Expensive. Feather mattresses? Rare. Silk or velvet coverlets? Reserved for those who dined on swan and drank wine thick as syrup. If you had embroidered pillows, you weren't just resting, you were sleeping on your family's net worth. But it wasn't just about wealth. A bed was the site of life's most important moments. Birth, illness, prayer, intimacy, even death. For many, especially in upper society, the bed was also a public space. Yes, public. Important visitors might be received while the bed's occupant was still reclining. This wasn't lazy, it was power. The lord or lady remained in bed, literally and figuratively, above their guest. It was the original power move before swivel chairs and corner offices. In French courts, nobles were known to hold levees, rising ceremonies, where favoured subjects watched the monarch rise, wash, and prepare for the day all from bed. Attendance was a privilege. Being invited into the bedroom was like being handed a backstage pass to power. Meanwhile, the poor made do with what they had. Some shared one bed between the entire family. Others slept in corners on bundles of hay or under tables. But even then, they aspired to someday own a real bed, perhaps second-hand from a noble house, or cobbled together from salvaged wood and dreams. There were also cultural variations. In certain regions, bed styles marked ethnic or regional identity. English nobles, for example, preferred grand four-posters with thick curtains, while Italian elites leaned toward elaborately carved platforms decorated with painted motifs. Historians still argue whether beds were more status-driven or comfort-focused. In reality, they were both. But many medieval beds were so overbuilt, so towering, creaking, and enshrined in fabric, that comfort may have been more symbolic than physical. And they weren't light. A noble bed could weigh hundreds of pounds, requiring teams of servants to move it. Which brings us to another point. Moving your bed was an event. When royalty travelled, their entire bed frame, mattress, linens, even curtains was packed up, carted across the countryside, and reassembled in the next castle. Why risk sleeping like a commoner? The need to own a bed of status extended beyond life. In death, many nobles were buried with items from their beds. Pillows, sheets, even entire bed frames were sometimes interred as signs of wealth and rank. One bishop was reportedly buried on a feather mattress that had once belonged to a queen. Now that's going out in style. And let's not forget the art. Beds were depicted in tapestries, paintings, and illuminated manuscripts not just as furniture, but as metaphors. A grand bed might symbolize power, sensuality, or even divine favor. Sleeping well wasn't just about dreams, it was about destiny. Tonight, as you lie in your minimalistic frame or cloud-soft mattress, you may not be surrounded by velvet drapes or carved angels, but you're part of a lineage stretching back centuries, a quiet echo of the time when to lie down was to make a statement. So next time someone says, "You made your bed, now lie in it," you can reply, "Good," because in the 14th century, this would have meant I was royalty. The trumpets sound, the banners are packed, the lord and lady are off to another estate. But before they mount their horses, servants are scurrying through the halls not to pack clothes, but to disassemble the bed. Because in medieval times, if you travelled, your bed came with you. Sounds absurd? Maybe. But for nobles and royals, Beds weren't just furniture, they were extensions of self, of status, of safety. And they weren't leaving them behind for just anyone to sit on. Imagine this: a carved oak frame taller than you, lined with tapestries, crowned with a canopy, stuffed with goose feathers and perfumed with lavender. Now imagine trying to fit that into a wagon. It happened all the time. These were called travelling beds. And yes, they were a thing. Nobility would often travel with portable bed frames, made of interlocking wood panels and secured by iron bolts or ropes. Some beds were specifically designed to collapse, like a 14th century version of a luxury camping setup minus the nylon and mosquito netting. The mattress, sheets, pillows and bed curtains would be rolled up, packed into trunks, and transported with the rest of the household. Servants would ride ahead to set up the bed in the new lodging, ensuring their lord or lady never had to sleep on something common or worse, previously used by a rival noble. And we're not just talking short hops between castles. When kings and queens went on progress, the royal tour of their lands, they brought everything with them: cooks, priests, advisors, and yes, their entire bed setup. In some cases, dozens of wagons were needed just to transport bedding and bedroom furniture. These beds weren't just symbols, they were familiar. Travelling was dangerous, roads were rough, and inns were unpredictable. Having your own bed meant control, hygiene, status, and maybe, just maybe, better sleep. Historians still debate how widespread travelling beds were among the lesser nobility or clergy. Some suggest it was limited to the upper crust. Others argue that even mid-ranking lords travelled with at least a modest bed frame and linens. What's certain is that for those who could afford it, bringing the bed was non-negotiable. There are even royal inventories listing the parts of these mobile beds: a folding bedstead of walnut, a feather mattress wrapped in crimson cloth, a silk canopy, green, embroidered with hawks. Some beds even had wheels, allowing them to be rolled from one room to another like a 14th century luxury gurney. One French queen insisted her bed be carried by hand rather than wheeled over cobblestones, for fear the jostling would damage the gilded posts. The result? 4 exhausted footmen and one perfectly pristine night's rest. Meanwhile, back in peasant land, travel was a very different affair. If you were lucky enough to have business in another village, maybe a market trip or a visit to family, you'd bring a blanket and hope for floor space. Inns, when available, were crowded, and beds were often shared with strangers. No one brought their mattress. They brought patience and a thick cloak. In monasteries and pilgrim hostels, simple cotangent-like beds were provided. But even then, seasoned travellers sometimes carried straw in sacks, which they could spread out as makeshift bedding. It was better than sleeping on dirt barely. And for long journeys, people got creative. Merchants might sleep on padded wagon benches, soldiers curled up in tent corners, wrapped in wool cloaks and tucked beneath shields. Even clergy might rest on stone benches in churches, praying for warmth between snores. But no matter the class, sleep while travelling was fragile. You were exposed to noise, danger, and the unfamiliar, which made the idea of a personal, transportable bed incredibly appealing, even enviable. There's even evidence of bedroom tents used during royal campaigns. These elaborate portable bedrooms were erected near battlefields, complete with rugs, cushions, scented torches, and sometimes even mobile garderobes. Also, the ruler could sleep like a king, literally, while his army trudged through the mud nearby. Of course, not all travelling beds were luxurious. Some were simple hammocks or roped frames strung with cloth. But even the humblest version offered familiarity, a sense of home amid chaos. In a world without hotels or Airbnb, your bed was your constant. And yes, this obsession led to some complications. In one 15th century case, a noble's bed arrived late to a host castle, causing a minor diplomatic incident. Why? He refused to sleep in another man's bed. The insult was considered worse than arriving without a gift. A temporary bed was hastily assembled from crates and fur rugs. It worked, sort of. So tonight, as you travel effortlessly between rooms, hotels, or countries with nothing but a carry-on, remember, in the past, to sleep with dignity, you had to bring half your house. And if you've ever complained about assembling IKEA furniture, just imagine doing it by torchlight, with 10 servants, and a mattress stuffed with duck feathers that must be fluffed exactly 6 times. You toss, you turn. The fire crackles low, shadows stretch long across the floor, and something about the silence feels off. Maybe it's that strange dream, or the chill crawling up your spine, or maybe it's the sense that something or someone is watching. In the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just a time for rest. It was a time when magic stirred, spells were cast, and curses crept into pillows and dreams. Tonight, we enter the realm of cursed sleep and enchanted dreams, where your blanket wasn't just keeping you warm, it was keeping you alive. Magic and the supernatural were deeply woven into medieval life, and that included bedtime. A neighbor's jealousy, a rival's grudge, or even an old woman's glare could supposedly infect your sleep with nightmares, illness, or worse. These weren't fairy tales, they were everyday fears. Let's start with the most chilling belief: the sleep curse. Medieval people believed someone could cast a spell spoken, written, or breathed to disrupt your rest, fill your dreams with terror, or prevent you from waking at all. These curses were often subtle, delivered through objects hidden in the bed. Knotted string under a pillow, a dead mouse tucked in the straw, or a bone charm stitched into a blanket's hem. People would wake with headaches, fevers, or paralyzing fear and declare, "I have been hexed." And often their neighbors agreed. To protect against this, beds were guarded by symbols. Crosses carved into the bedposts, protective herbs sewn into mattress seams, iron nails driven into the bed frame to keep out evil spirits. And above all, prayers. So many prayers. Sleep was never guaranteed, but it could be fortified. There were also tales of sleep thieves, witches or spirits who crept into homes to steal a person's energy or dreams. These weren't your standard nightmare. Victims described waking drained, confused, their minds emptied. Some believed these thieves were envious souls or the vengeful dead. A few blamed elves or fair folk, who were said to ride sleepers through the night. If a loved one began to sleep poorly, talking nonsense, seeing visions, or trembling upon waking, it was a cause for immediate concern. The house would be cleansed. A cunning man or wise woman might be summoned to undo the knot, break the hex, or perform a blessing ritual involving smoke, salt, or even urine left at the crossroads. Historians still debate whether these rituals were truly believed to work, or if they simply offered comfort through structure and tradition. Either way, they persisted. For hundreds of years, some people went further, using enchantment as protection. Talismans made from silver or bone were tucked under pillows, engraved with Latin phrases or runes. Somnus sanctus protegat me. Holy sleep, protect me. A simple phrase that turned your straw mattress into a sacred space. But magic wasn't always malevolent. Some dreams were thought to be sent from angels or saints, offering comfort, guidance, or warning. These were called vision dreams, and they were often shared aloud the next day, especially in religious households. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites might sleep on the church floor, hoping for a dream vision from a local saint. If they received one, it was considered divine proof of their devotion. Some would even write down the dream and leave it at the altar as an offering. Other dreams were considered prophetic, not just personal, but political. Kings and queens sometimes consulted dream interpreters or astrologer priests, who would analyze sleep visions for signs of war, betrayal, or celestial approval. And of course, there were love spells. Young women were known to place certain herbs under their pillows, bay leaves, thyme, yarrow, to summon dreams of their future husbands. One folk rhyme went, "If I sleep with rosemary near, my true love's face shall soon appear." If the dreamer saw a man offering water, it meant kindness. If he walked away, heartache ahead. Even illnesses were believed to stem from enchanted sleep. A fever that arrived suddenly in the night might be blamed on a witch's curse, especially if accompanied by strange dreams or hallucinations. Healing could involve burning the bedding, reciting specific psalms, or boiling a hairbrush, believed to trap the spell and dissolve it. And let's not forget the night hag, a creature who sat on the chest of the sleeper, causing breathlessness, fear, and a sense of dread. Descriptions of this phenomenon eerily resemble modern sleep paralysis, but in the medieval mind, it was proof of a spiritual assault. To prevent her visit, people placed a broom beside the bed, or slept with a sharp object like scissors or a small knife under the pillow. The idea was not to stab the hag, though tempting, but to confuse or repel her. Spirits, it was believed, hated tangled bristles and iron tools. Tonight, in your safe, protected space, it may be hard to imagine lying down in fear of an unseen enemy slipping into your dreams. But in the candlelit quiet of a medieval cottage, where shadows moved like whispers and superstition hung in the air like smoke, sleep was never just sleep. It was a gateway, a risk, a ritual. So go ahead, fluff your pillow, turn off your lamp, and rest easy. No one's hidden a knotted cord under your blanket. Probably. But maybe, just maybe, keep a sprig of rosemary nearby, for sweet dreams and old time's sake. The door creaks as you step inside. The walls are rough stone, the air smells faintly of smoke and wool, and you can hear the wind pushing against wooden shutters. But look around closely, and you'll realize something odd. The entire house is built around the bed. In medieval homes, the bed wasn't just furniture, it was architecture. Its position, structure, and role influenced the very layout of a household. Whether in a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, the place where people slept shaped how they lived, moved, and even designed their space. Start with the basics. Most medieval homes, especially in rural areas, were single-room dwellings. One room for cooking, working, storing tools, raising children, hiding valuables, and yes, sleeping. So where did the bed go? Right at the center, near the hearth. Why? Because that's where it was warmest. The hearth was the home's only heat source, and sleeping close to it reduced the risk of frostbite, illness, or waking up with your breath frozen on your nose. The result? The bed became the anchor point around which everything else was arranged. If you were a peasant, your bed was probably a pallet or straw mattress placed just beside the fire pit. Your cooking pots would hang just a few feet away. Chickens might roost in the rafters above. Children would curl up on blankets or under benches nearby. It was tight, loud, smoky. But it was home. As homes became more complex, beds migrated to niches or alcoves, small, recessed areas carved out of walls or tucked behind wooden partitions. Some were little more than box beds, cabinet, like sleeping compartments with doors you could shut to stay warm or hide from prying eyes. In Northern Europe, these box beds became a staple. In Brittany and parts of the Netherlands, entire families might share a sleeping cupboard, often stacked 2 or 3 tiers high. Think bunk beds meet fortress. With less air, yes, but more privacy. Sort of. Historians still argue whether these box beds were hygienic or hazardous. Some claim they trapped body heat and saved lives in winter. Others note they also trapped smoke, lice, and every sneeze from your 4 coughing cousins. But they were efficient, and in small spaces, efficiency was everything. In wealthier homes, beds got their own rooms, a luxury that marked your status like a crown on your wall. The solar, or private family room, typically on an upper floor, was where lords, ladies, and their children slept. The bed dominated the space, raised up on platforms or under carved beams, often with its own step-stool to climb in. Even castles were designed with sleep in mind. Bedchambers were placed on upper floors, away from smoke and drafty hallways. Some were positioned for morning sunlight, believed to be healthier and more spiritually uplifting. Others were set deep inside towers. For security, you didn't want a murderer sneaking in before morning prayers. And let's talk about guest rooms. A spare bed, if you had one, was a sign of wealth and generosity. Visitors might sleep in the same room as the hosts, but if they got their own bed, that meant they were respected, or rich, or both. Even monasteries reflected sleep in their layout. Monks slept in dormitories, usually above the cloisters, arranged in long rows of beds or pallets. The positioning of these rooms was deliberate, away from the kitchen and scriptorium, close to the chapel for midnight prayer access. Architecture didn't just reflect sleep, it shaped it. Narrow doors, tight stairwells, and small windows helped trap heat, minimize light, and dampen sound. Stone walls kept rooms cooler in summer and warmer in winter, ideal for uninterrupted slumber, if you didn't mind the occasional bat overhead. Some medieval homes even featured built-in headboards made from carved plaster or stone, painted with religious symbols. A bed with a cross etched above it was considered not only sacred, but spiritually protected. The belief was that evil spirits would be repelled by the holy markings. In peasant cottages, space was so tight that lofts were built overhead, allowing the bed, or more often, hay bedding to be raised above the animals, smoke, and general chaos below. You climbed up with a ladder and hoped not to roll off in your sleep. Another clever solution? Curtained partitions. Hung from beams or nailed into walls, these cloth dividers separated the bedroom from the rest of the space. They weren't soundproof, but they gave the illusion of privacy. And in a home with 3 generations, 6 kids, and 1 cow, illusions were everything. In townhouses and merchant homes, beds were often tucked into the warmest corner, with small storage chests or shelves built into the surrounding walls. Some craftsmen even slept above their shops, rolling out bedding near their tools, guarding their livelihood as they rested. And here's a curious fringe fact. In some areas, it was customary to build the home around the bed. Literally. The bed would be placed first, usually the most expensive item a family owned, and the house would be constructed to accommodate it. A practical choice? Maybe. A symbolic one? Definitely. So tonight, as you move through your home, from room to room, with doors and dimmers and carpeted floors, think back to the time when sleep shaped the very walls around you, where every nook, every corner, every curtain was part of a grand design not just for living but for resting. In a world of drafty stone and flickering firelight, the bed wasn't just where you dreamed, it was where you lived. It's late now, and the candles are burning low. Outside, the village is still. But inside, in cottages and castles alike, voices whisper, hands reach beneath blankets, and stories are quietly passed from mouth to mouth. Because in the Middle Ages, night was social, and sleep, well, it had its own kind of community. Welcome to the social life of sleep, the hidden hours of connection, confession, and comfort that happened only after the rest of the world went quiet. For most people, sleep wasn't a private affair. Families, servants, and guests all shared beds or rooms, often out of necessity, sometimes out of custom. And when you're lying inches from someone else in the dark, conversation happens. These weren't formal discussions. These were soft, vulnerable moments. A child asking questions before drifting off. A husband confessing a worry. A mother humming a tune while stroking a baby's hair. It was intimacy without pretense or performance. And in the hush of that first or second sleep, people let their guards down. They whispered fears, shared gossip, plotted futures. Some historians suggest that important decisions, marriages, trades, travel, were often finalized during these in-between hours, when hearts were calm and distractions had melted away. In noble homes, bedchambers were semi-public spaces, especially in early evenings. A lady might receive visitors in her room, share news with attendants, or host quiet gatherings called counselings. These weren't scandalous, they were part of the household rhythm. Even kings received advisors, while reclining wrapped in blankets, sipping spiced wine, casually discussing treaties between mouthfuls of honey cakes. The bed was a place of power, but also of diplomacy. In monasteries, after nightly prayers, monks would walk silently back to their dormitories, their sandals padding softly on stone floors. Though speaking was forbidden, the walk itself was communal, a shared rhythm, a shared purpose. And once in bed, even the sounds of others sleeping, breathing, shifting, occasionally snoring, was part of the monastic bond. Historians still debate whether these quiet exchanges shaped larger decisions or simply forged deeper personal ties. But there's no question that the medieval night was full of connection, not just rest. In peasant homes, with entire families sharing a single room and sometimes a single mattress, sleep was a tangle of limbs and breath, and whispered words. Children would ask their parents about saints, spirits, and why stars moved. Grandparents told stories of how things used to be, and lovers married or secret used the darkness to express what daylight forbade. Even in inns and way stations, where strangers shared beds, people found ways to connect. There are written accounts of travellers who made lifelong friendships after sharing a bed and a bottle of ale on a rainy night. Something about lying beside someone in the dark made conversation easier, honesty more natural. In villages, the sleep hours were also for secrets. Some would sneak out during the watch to meet lovers, settle scores, or steal chickens. It happened. Others used the night to pray privately, away from prying eyes. And if someone got up and didn't return, that was news the next morning. And yes, it was gossiped about. There's even a wonderful old term for these intimate conversations before sleep. Night talking. Not quite dreaming, not quite waking. Just that liminal space where truth floats up like mist. In some communities, it was believed that confessions made at night carried special weight. If you said it under moonlight, it had to be real. For children, night meant stories. Not just fairy tales, but cautionary tales. Don't wander after dark, or the witch bird will find you. Don't leave your shoes out, or they'll walk off on their own. Don't sleep with your mouth open, or a spirit might slip in. Adults listened too. Whether whispered by firelight or murmured in bed, these stories carried wisdom, warning, and wonder. They taught you how to live and how to rest. And then, as sleep crept in, conversations would taper off. A hand would find another's. A final sigh. A last murmur of, "Good night, love," or "God keep you." So much of medieval life was communal. Meals, labor, prayer, and sleep was no exception. In a world without alarms, headphones, or late-night scrolling, the hours between dusk and dawn belong to each other. Tonight, as you curl under your blanket in solitude, or beside someone you love, know that you're part of an ancient rhythm, one where the silence of sleep was never empty, but full of shared breath, quiet laughter, and whispered dreams. Because sleep, for them, wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was about opening your heart just a little before the dark took you. You open your eyes. Morning has arrived, but not sharply. The light is soft, slipping gently through cracks in the shutters. The fire's gone cold, but you don't shiver. The world feels slower, quieter. And as you lie still, you wonder why it feels a little different from the morning before. Because last night, for the first time, you didn't sleep all at once. You slept like they did. Like they did. The medieval sleep cycle, so foreign to modern life, is still tucked somewhere deep in our bones. That rhythm of first sleep and second, of dreams that come, and conversations in between, of nighttime prayers, firelight flickering, and waking not with alarms, but with awareness. Yet something happened. Over time, the artificial light came, the long factory hours, the deadlines, schedules, glowing screens, and the pressure to sleep right. All of it pulled us away from the natural rhythm that shaped generations before us, from the way people once let their bodies rest when they needed, and let their minds wander in the dark. Historians still debate what exactly killed the first sleep. Was it candles, clocks, or capitalism? Maybe all three. But they agree on one thing: something was lost. Still, the echoes remain. In the nights when you wake at 2 a.m. and stare at the ceiling, not with panic, but with thought. In the midnight musings. In the whispered conversations when the world is quiet, and you finally have space to feel. Those aren't flaws. Those are ancient habits, still tucked behind your heartbeat. Tonight, maybe try something new, or rather, something old. Step away from the glow. Let the silence stretch. Let the dark wrap around you like wool. And if you wake too early, don't rush. Let yourself sit in the in-between. Breathe. Stretch. Maybe even whisper something into the shadows, just to hear how your voice sounds without the noise of day. Because sleep isn't just about closing your eyes. It's about remembering that you're human, that you were built for darkness and dreams, for quiet and cold, for blankets, bodies, and breath. And somewhere, in the corners of a medieval room, lit only by a dying ember, someone long ago is doing the same. They're waking from first sleep. They're whispering to their child. They're writing by candlelight. They're dreaming, just like you. Now, let's soften everything. Your breath, your shoulders, your thoughts. Let them sink slowly, like the sun dropping beneath the hills. Let the story settle, like dust in a quiet room. The crackle of the hearth is gone now. The walls are still. The village is asleep. You are alone, but never lonely. Because you've walked through time. You've wandered candlelit corridors, huddled in straw, watched the night stretch across stone. You've shared beds with strangers, prayed beside monks, felt the flick of a curtain and the warmth of a dog at your feet. You've remembered that sleep is sacred. Not something to battle, not something to schedule, but something to surrender to. And now, here you are, breathing slowly, blanket tucked, world faded. Nothing to fix, nowhere to go. Just the soft hum of a fan, the hush of stillness, and the knowledge that people have done this very thing for hundreds, thousands of years. You're part of them now, so close your eyes, gently, heavily, and sleep. Sleep like it's a gift, because it is.